We've all heard this song before. Paid spokespeople posing as science professionals are brought into the fray, sometimes with funding, to dispute or confuse public health science. In fact, the tactics of misinformation and denying evidence that tobacco companies used during the tobacco and lung cancer era in the 1950s and 60s are the very same tactics we see used today on the topic of climate change. Interestingly, we saw these strategies used also during the discussions about acid rain, ozone depletion, DDT, and other pesticides during the 1960s. And nowadays, as the IPCC says, rhetoric and misinformation on climate change and the deliberate undermining of science have contributed to misperceptions of the scientific consensus. What were these deniers, these merchants of menace, these peddlers of doubt doing? I'm Paul Burns, and this is Climate Action Matters. We are a fact-based discussion about climate change and Canada's transition from fossil fuels. We put people in touch with good information and point to the best ways of getting involved. In a relatively well-informed, free press-loving place like Canada, we are still dealing with climate change denial. Today we'll talk about climate change denial and what it is precisely and what we can do about it. What is climate change denial? If you're watching this and you live in the early 21st century, then you know that climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather. And there is unprecedented international scientific consensus on its causes and impacts. Climate change denial, or global warming denial, is the dismissal or unwarranted doubt that contradicts this scientific consensus. Some people who deny climate change are sitting around our own dinner tables or even in the corridors of power. And we can probably think that it's they just think it's a controversy or something to take sides on because they enjoy being a contrarian. But a less gentle definition comes from Dunlap, who says that those who cast doubt on the scientific consensus of climate change are funded by organizations that he calls the denial machine of industrial or political or other interest groups. And they are trying to create uncertainty about the science in general, or global warming in particular. Denialism has a recent and dark history. We can start with the tobacco roots. From the time that scientists were first linking tobacco to lung disease, back in the 1950s, there's been the phenomenon of well-funded communicators that were less focused on robust debate and spirited, lively discourse, and more pointed to drawing legitimacy away from the science to protect the profits of industry. This might seem like a bit much. We'll have to take a look at the details. The studies by Michael Mann, John Cook, Oreskes, and Conway, the links are below, do a very detailed job of chronicling these communications. They name the key players and the organizations active in these campaigns over the last few decades. They document how industrial interests launched information campaigns, wrote misleading summaries, gave them to the media, misrepresented data to politicians, and advocated for an equal voice in the media, set up quasi-scientific think tanks. And they do this in extensive detail with mass amounts of source material. The researchers outline the funding mechanism, the links to politicians, public officials, the debates in the journals and the news media, and their stories look at the development of denialism in American politics. And this has had a devastating consequence all over the world and here in Canada. The chronology of the story is nested in key, high-profile public health discussions of the last few decades. First, tobacco. There was extensive scientific evidence that smoking caused lung cancer. Immediately when the studies were published, there was huge pushback from industry and many manipulations in the media to discredit the science. The science won that debacle, and now there are warnings on cigarettes and even some active lawsuits by government against tobacco for the health cost consequences. Acid rain. There was emerging evidence that certain types of pollutants, CO2 and SO2, had destructive impacts on lakes in the northeast of the United States, Canada, and Sweden. The science was published, and there was a replay of the massive pushback from people with vested interests. They manipulated media. They influenced officials. The science won. Well, it partially won on this one. And the regulations to address acid rain were eventually passed in the 1990s, and the amount of SO2 has decreased sharply. More work needs to be done. The next one, ozone depletion. There was evidence that certain chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, caused depletion of the ozone layer by way of some complex reactions in the atmosphere. And finally, after a long struggle with deniers that funded fake research, the science prevailed with the Montreal Protocol of 1988. And the dangerous CFCs were reduced, saving millions of lives. Secondhand smoke. Secondhand smoke was found by scientists to cause cancer. In response, the tobacco industry coordinated scientific controversy with the purpose of stopping regulation of their products. There was a very unnecessarily long struggle against science deniers. But by the early 2000s, there are smoke-free laws and regulations in many countries. And these are also popular, 80% support. Now the case of insecticides. The pattern of discovery and then industry pushback and burying the truth prevailed even in the story of pesticides and DDT. The work of brilliant author Rachel Carlson, she wrote Silent Spring, was later maligned by industry as part of a strategy to malign science and science-based regulation. And even long after the facts, they are still fact-free. The vested interests. At each one of these episodes, there's an intense struggle for science against vested, well-funded interests that actively lobby governments. The research on this is robust and engaging because there are many references to actual news stories, to government reports and records of congressional hearings. Interestingly, the researchers spent time on noting how the machinery for all of this resistance to science in America emerged during the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and even to the 2000s. Names are used, and some of the names are the same from episode to episode. Imagine some of the very same individuals were involved in the numerous campaigns against tobacco regulations and then quickly turned to fight against regulations for sulfur dioxide by denying acid rain, and then turned to champion the further sales of DDT and advocate for ignoring environmental science. What are they doing? During this era, industry was successful at hiring their own spokespeople. They hired fake research. They submitted stories to national news outlets pretending to represent science, actively discredited scientists and journalists. They funded misinformation campaigns. They harassed and discredited individual researchers. This sounds too far-fetched. But this isn't the stuff of conjecture or guesswork. This is well documented and listed out for everyone to see, including the actual correspondences, the ads, and the excerpts from congressional hearings. These communicators established think tanks that had clear agenda of protecting American industry from science. I won't name the think tanks here, but they are named in the books. And these think tanks still exist today and have copycat organizations here in Canada. So what is the impact of all this? Why is it a big deal if there's a few naysayers out there and some contrarians? Even if there are vested interests and shifty campaigns, can't regular thinking people, can we actually be dissuaded from a couple of op-eds and false advertisements? Well, it turns out that these campaigns can be very successful, especially when it comes to delays and perceptions. Meet the Consensus Project. The team at Skeptical Science worked on a project to identify the consensus on climate science and researched how this interacted with public perceptions of the consensus. The first point from this is something they identify as the consensus gap. Their analysis shows that there is significantly more consensus among scientists than the public actually perceives. And the consensus gap is higher for certain conservative perspectives, and this is very true in Canada. In addition, there are specific well-funded disinformation campaigns that are designed to discredit science and widen the consensus gap. In these sorts of communications, there is an intention to convey a sense that there was debate or that their conclusions were not yet settled. As one of the spokespeople from the tobacco industry once said, "Confusion is our product." This particular intention was the focus later for fake controversies around acid rain, ozone layer depletion, and the increased need for regulations for pesticides. How does this manufacturing of doubt work? Well, let's take a look at the tactics. The ideas can be managed by words that start with D, so we can have a handy way of remembering them. First, there's deny. Deny the facts. If there's a finding in science, say for example that ice sheets are melting, the tactic here is to say, "No, it's not," or "I heard that some scientists don't say it's melting." And this is designed, if you fall for it, to place the onus of proof on the person pointing out the fact. Actually, as we know, if you make a claim, especially a bold claim, then the onus is on you to explain the basis for your claim. Deflect the argument. This is where the other topic is spuriously introduced. So if someone says, "The ice sheets are melting," you counter that with, "Hey, there's a lot of advantage for Canada for an open seaway through the Northwest Passage." They could even add, "Hey, prove to me how it not be a good thing for us to have an open Northwest Passage." Well, we weren't talking about an open seaway. Distrust the messenger. You can answer any point about this with the "scientists are just trying to get more funding for research," or "that particular study was flawed." Discredit the science. There's a set of claims that work in this category. You just state the claim. "The scientists do not agree." Yeah, they do agree. Or, "The science on this stuff is always changing." Well, no, it isn't. We see a lot of this approach actually makes it all the way to the media stories when they imply that something is controversial when it's not, or giving fair time to opposing views when it's like giving fair airtime to arguments for flat earth or astrology. Discredit the intention. This is where scientists are always looking for ways to influence the political agenda, that's what they say, or bring in more socialism, or make a buck with dramatic stories about rising water and sea levels. Well, that's not really what's going on. More on tactics. A final last point on this, I have to credit Michael Mann for, which is doomism. And this is when you encourage doomism or disengagement. And it's a really wicked part of the arsenal. It's to throw up your arms and go with, "Well, enough about this then. There's not much we can do about this. All is lost. We are all doomed." Well, no, we're not. As Michael Mann put it, doomers go the same place as deniers, toward inaction. And that's wrong. There's no time for it. For a point of view on the Canadian context for denial, we can turn to one author that says, "The new climate denialism is when our leaders say that they get the climate crisis, but they don't do anything or the politics that aligns with what the science says we have to do." And that's from Canadian author Seth Klein. Climate change denial and the associated misinformation and professional discrediting is alive and well in Canada. Does this have a potential to slow policy change progress, distort public opinion, distract from important urgent matters of Canada's inevitable transition from fossil fuels? Yeah, it does. We just have to look at the lessons of the past, from tobacco, acid rain, secondhand smoke. Denialism causes huge delays. It exacerbates regionalism, creates more friction and more work, and confuses government direction on important and inevitable policy shifts. Climate change denial should be tolerated probably about as much as the casual acceptance of drunk driving or any enthusiasm there might be for public hanging. The experts tell us that successful science communication campaigns typically feature simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. Given the stakes, this puts us all in the business of being trusted sources and speaking often. So therefore, get excited. Talk about it. Talk about it a lot with your friends. Vote. Help make it normal to talk about climate change. Please take a second to subscribe and use the bell. As usual, the footnotes and the links for all of this are below. See you next time on Climate Action Matters.